The Jets get humiliated in Buffalo in a blowout loss to the Bills. It's a game that exposed the Jets' many, many flaws, including the team's most unforgivable flaw and the flaws the team needs to address immediately this offseason. Let's break it all down today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Monday, December 30th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. I really appreciate your support, Jets fans, especially in what's been an absolutely dismal season for this team. And that dismal season took an even more dismal turn yesterday as the Jets were blown out in Buffalo by the Bills. The final score was 40-14, and the Jets only scored their 14 points in garbage time. The Bills at that point of the game had the defensive personnel on the field you'd expect to see in the fourth quarter of a preseason game. There's nothing good you can say about this New York Jets performance, and this is a point where I don't even know if it's worth comparing this to the other losses, because you start asking yourself, is this rock bottom? Well, for this Jets team, it seems like there's never a rock bottom. It's been that way for a decade and a half. Is as bad as the rest of this season has this been the lowest moment? I don't know, because all these moments are so low. I think sometimes you have a tendency to think the latest thing that happened is the lowest moment, but there've been some really bad moments for this Jets team this season. This team is just so flawed in every way, and I feel like you run out of ways to say the same thing, because this is not a team that's remotely close to being a quality football team. And, I guess if there's any silver lining, sometimes there's a temptation, if you get on like a little late season roll, to delude yourself into thinking your team's better than it really is. And I got a little sense of that when the Jets beat Jacksonville 2 weeks ago. People started talking about, especially after a big offensive performance, well, we just fixed the defense and we bring everybody back, we'll be in good shape. A game like this, I think, is very much a reality check, because there's really nothing good you can say about the team. The team is deeply flawed in every way. The offense is no good. The defense is no good. The special teams aren't any good. The coaching is horrible. There's nothing. The team plays dumb situational football. And I think at this point, this team is so deeply flawed in so many different ways that we complain about the same stuff every week, yet we complain about new things every week. It's just a really interesting phenomenon with this team. And, when it comes to these flaws, there's some things that are more forgivable than others. The roster is not as good as it was made out to be before the season. I'm not saying this is a bad roster, but this was billed as a Super Bowl type roster, and it is not. It's, compared with the Mike McCagnon, Adam Gase Jets, yeah, it's a pretty good roster. It's certainly not the type of roster that should be 4-12. But it's also not the roster of a contender. It's not a roster that's on par with Buffalo. And at some point, you have to say, you know what, I can forgive players for not executing, because the Jets just aren't as good as some of the teams that they face on a week-to-week basis. Now, I think in building this team, mistakes were made by the front office, the former general manager, Joe Douglas. I think that there were risks that were taken. And I think that, a lot of times the front office and the media and the owner and the fan base conveniently looked past the risk of some of the moves the Jets made. But you reach a point in the season where you have to come to peace with that. And you know what, guys that can't execute, I don't know if you can say I can forgive it, but it's just a part of life. It's a fact of life for this team. The coaching is really bad. Yeah, you can get mad at Jeff Ulbrich. He's obviously in over his head. But at the same time, he did not seek this job out. He didn't want to be the head coach. He didn't apply to be the head coach. This was thrust upon him. Of course, mistakes were made when we're talking about the way the team built the coaching staff, or the way the team handled the coaching staff the last year or so, because it was just a year ago that Woody Johnson revealed in an interview with the New York Post he decided to bring Robert Saleh back for the 2024 season, when Saleh was a deeply, deeply flawed coach. He could have gotten a fresh start. He could have brought in somebody new, like maybe a Jim Harbaugh. Maybe that's shooting too high, but there were opportunities to bring in somebody better. Woody Johnson looked past his flaws. And then 5 games into this season, he fired Saleh and brought on Jeff Ulbrich. And I don't think Woody Johnson figured out that Robert Saleh was a flawed coach. I don't think he did any introspection. I think he responded to the loudest voices in the fan base, the people that scream on Twitter, who always claim that there's a quick solution to a team as flawed as the Jets. They claimed that replacing Saleh with Ulbrich would be a quick fix that it would solve everything, and that was never the case. The problem was the Jets should have gotten rid of Saleh a year ago, but they made the bad situation worse by getting rid of him 5 games into the season, because the choices were not at 5 games into the season. The choices were not Saleh and somebody better. The choices were Saleh and Ulbrich. And Ulbrich was put into a situation where, he had to oversee the defense still. And I think looking back, it was a mistake that maybe he should have named somebody else the defensive coordinator, but maybe there wasn't somebody good enough on the staff to do that. But the point being, at some level, as bad as his coaching is, you have to live with it. You just have to acknowledge that it's a fact of life for this team. And this coaching staff will be gone. You can acknowledge the offense and defense aren't very good at this point. I don't know that any of this is forgivable, but at some point, again, the acceptance phase in the stages of grief kicks in. The thing that I find really unforgivable is the complete lack of effort this team shows on a consistent basis, because this is at least the third game I can look at this season where I can say this team looked like it quit. And that was true in the second half of this game. I said this against Pittsburgh on Sunday night, week 7. I said it in November against Arizona, which was pretty much from the outset the team laid down in that game. This team quits too frequently. And I know they don't do it every week. What team in the NFL history has ever quit every single week they've played? When this team faces adversity, it folds, and that's just there's just a complete lack of professionalism from this organization from top to bottom. We know who sets the tone. It's the owner, Woody Johnson, who does not remotely comport himself in a professional manner in any aspect of his job performance, in any aspect of speaking with the media, in any aspect of addressing the fan base. The man is extremely unprofessional. I mean, you can just read the transcripts of some of the stuff he says. I can't believe any owner would say some of the stuff he says, much less an owner who's been the least successful owner in any of the major 4 North American professional sports leagues in the last 15 years. But you see it on the field. You see this team, not giving effort. You see 16 penalties. Now I know, early in this game, it felt like the Clete Blakeman show. It felt like the referee Clete Blakeman thought everybody paid tickets to watch go see him. I mean, there were two times early in the first quarter where they stopped the play to announce that there was no flag on the field. But 16 penalties, 5 personal fouls. No effort. And you see it over and over again. And look, even in the post-game press conference, Sauce Gardner says that, seems like some people have checked out. And, the play that comes to mind to me, and I think that, I don't know this for sure, but I have a feeling that when I think back to the 2024 Jets season, one play from this game will really stick out in mind as something that summarized the entire season. It's not the reason the Jets are a bad team this year. Look, this team was out of the race long before this game. Didn't cost the Jets this game. At the point it happened, it was 26-0. The game was already long lost. But it's a play that I felt was very symbolic, and that was a play where Garrett Wilson fumbled in the third quarter. It was a bad job by Garrett. He didn't do a good job after the catch. The ball bounced near Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers dove away from the ball. He dove to make it look like he was going for the ball so that nobody would question his effort. You could clearly say he was trying to avoid a hit. And if that isn't symbolic of everything, the guy who's supposed to be the leader of this team, and again, on some level, the season's almost over. Rodgers doesn't want to get hurt, especially in a game where the Jets are getting blown out. I guess on some level I can understand. But the guy who's supposed to be the leader of this team, the guy who's the symbol of this era of failure, not going for a ball, the guy who's spoken a lot about the team needing to show pride, about how the team needing to show effort. When the going got tough, Aaron Rodgers dove away from the ball. And apparently he told Jeff Ulbrich, he took himself out of the game. He still told Jeff Ulbrich, he mentioned this in the post-game press conference, maybe it's time for Tyrod Taylor to go in the game. And then Tyrod Taylor got that, fourth quarter of a preseason game defense and put a couple touchdowns on the board. But I just feel like there's a lot of symbolism in that moment. And it says a lot about this team. Giving up a long touchdown on the screen when Mitchell Trubisky's in the game. Josh Allen, throwing the ball up for grabs and the guy coming down with it after that fumble. This was a team that just did not come to play in the second half. It's a team that showed very little pride. And again, we know the Jets are a bad team. We know that they were overmatched in this game. We know Buffalo's better. We know this team's not as good as they thought they would be. We know that the coaching staff is abysmal. But, I think you can control your effort. You can't control losing games in the NFL. That happens. But you most definitely can control how hard you play. And once again, we see this team not playing hard. Called before this game on Friday when I did my preview, I asked whether this would be a U-Haul game where the players are just focused on the offseason. We got our answer. Yes. And it feels very symbolic of a difficult season. It's one thing to be bad. It's another thing to be bad like this. It's just really tough to forgive. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll move into some more tangible flaws for this team, which I think were pretty evident in this game. Not that anybody really needed a reminder of any of them. There are some things the Jets need to fix this offseason. A lot the Jets need to fix this offseason. But there are some things that really need to take priority, and this game exposed them. And we'll talk about what they are as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Prize Picks. If you love watching the game, you're going to love Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy. Whether it's football, basketball, or any of your favorite sports, Prize Picks makes your holidays bigger and brighter. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money on Prize Picks. Plus, this holiday season, they're giving away $30+ million in rewards during Pickmas and offering 2 free picks in December. And when your picks hit, Pickmas makes it easy to cash out. You can get your money in as fast as 15 minutes. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 instantly when you play just $5. Prize Picks, run your game. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And was the case with most of our Monday shows through the 2024 season, this is recapping a Jets loss, and a rather ugly loss at that. The Jets were defeated by the Buffalo Bills. Jets were annihilated by the Buffalo Bills. The final score was 40-14, and this game was 40-0 in the fourth quarter. This was just a really dismal performance by the New York Jets. And look, it exposed a lot about this team. I think one of the things it exposed as much as anything are the real problem areas for this team that need to be addressed heading into the 2025 season. And at the risk of stating the obvious, I mean, the quarterback position, the Jets just need to change there. And this game doesn't prove anything because I think it's been proven through the season that the Jets just can't consider bringing Aaron Rodgers back next season. This is not, it's partially a financial decision, but it's also just a player performance issue. In this game, Rodgers played miserably. He was 12 of 18, 112 yards, a 6.2 average, 2 interceptions, a 1.2 a QBR, a 44 passer rating. Over the last couple of weeks, and this was especially true after the game against Jacksonville, there was this movement, Rodgers should come back. And there's an argument out there, and this is, I think, Mike Francesa, the legendary New York radio host who does a podcast, has been really banging this drum that, you have to separate Rodgers, the player, from all the other stuff. And, there are people who said, well, if you just look at Rodgers' performance on the field, he's the best option for the Jets in 2025. And you just have to separate it from all the other stuff. And you just bring Rodgers back as a player. You don't give him any personnel control. You don't give him control over anything. And I think the first response to that is that you can't really separate that from the other stuff, because Rodgers is at a point in his career where I don't think he's going to be fine just being the bridge quarterback. I don't think he's at a point where he's going to be fine, if the team loses, heading to the bench for 8 weeks to let some young guy take over for him. I don't think he's going to be fine, ceasing to go on Pat McAfee's show. Because if you have a bridge quarterback who's not part of your future, you don't want the distractions that those interviews cause. I don't think Rodgers is going to be okay with Devontae Adams leaving, which is, I think, something the Jets need to look at, because financially, as good as Adams has been this year, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to bring him back. I don't see how you can separate those things, but this analysis misses a key point, is that there's increasingly difficult to argue that Rodgers, the quarterback, is anything special. Because when I watch Rodgers play, and this has been true through the whole season, the passes he hits, for the most part, are passes I'd expect like any competent quarterback to hit. I mean, he's not doing anything special out there. He's not making the wow plays for the most part that he did back in Green Bay. This is a guy who looks like a shell of the future Hall of Fame quarterback he was with the Packers. And listen, this is not about what Aaron Rodgers was in the past, because Aaron Rodgers will be in the Hall of Fame on the first ballot. That's not even debatable. Aaron Rodgers is one of the top 15 quarterbacks to ever play in the league. And you can make a compelling argument that he's one of the top 10 quarterbacks to ever play in the league. He's had a tremendous career. But I mean, I don't know what people are watching when they think that this guy is a dynamic player anymore. I don't know what people are watching if they think this guy is anything more than just a guy who can hit a few passes here or there, like a low-level starter. stopgap kind of guy. And if you're going to go with a stopgap kind of guy, you can go with somebody who costs less and, gives you, creates less headaches for you, creates less distractions. This game, it shouldn't be the end because the end should have come long ago of this discussion, but Rodgers just can't play in this league. Rodgers can't play at a super high level in this league anymore. And when you factor in all the baggage, I don't see what the argument is to bring him back next season. Now, also, another issue in this game was the offensive line, a unit that's been good for the Jets this year, but there was a huge problem with the offensive line because with Olu Fashanu out, Max Mitchell started at left tackle. Max Mitchell was responsible for a safety, but just not blocking a guy off the edge in the first half. Then Morgan Moses went down, so Carter Warren went in. And you know what's funny is sometimes a player proves his value. Sometimes the acquisition of a player, the value is proven when that player is not in the game. And, all the people doubting Olu Fashanu, the Jets selecting him in the first round this year, well, I hope you watch that game because that shows you what life is like without Olu Fashanu. If you have Christmas was just obviously a few days ago. And so you probably saw the movie It's a Wonderful Life on TV airing nonstop. It's about a guy who, gets shown what his life would have been like, or life would have been like for all the people he knows and loves if he had never been born. This was like the It's a Wonderful Life version of the Jets not drafting Olu Fashanu, what the tackle position would look like. Not very good. Now, what I will say for the Jets is obviously with Fashanu back next year, he's looking promising. And three pretty solid guys on the interior, even though John Simpson had a rough game in this one. And the offensive line's looking okay if they can figure out the right tackle position. But one thing the Jets obviously need to do better is hit in the later rounds because you get offensive line depth through the mid to late rounds of the draft. And Joe Douglas completely whipped. The two guys we mentioned, Max Mitchell, Carter Warren, they just haven't done the job. And, part of the problem with Douglas, I think he traded away too many of his late round picks. So he didn't give himself enough swings of the bat to try and find quality depth on the offensive line. But that's something that's got to improve. Jets need to start hitting on, and you just need to do a better job finding and developing these mid to late round offensive linemen. Because, these guys aren't going to be starters, but depth's important on the offensive line. And the Jets' lack of depth on the offensive line was exposed in this game. Now, I think a lot of teams would struggle when they're down to their number 4, number 5 tackles. But these guys just haven't been good players. Both, pair of 4th round picks who have not developed at all for this team. Not great. And then also in the trenches, and this is a bigger problem, the defensive line. And the defensive line, you got Quinnen Williams, who's not having a good season, who did not play well in this game. And I guess Will McDonald's okay as a pass rusher, purely as like a situational guy. But aside from that, you're starting from scratch. None of these guys, Kinlaw has been a disaster. Leki Fatu's been a disaster. And of course, the ultimate disaster, and Hassan Reddick, who just doesn't seem like he's trying out there. I'm not trying to, I really hesitate to say that about a player, but there was one play where Hassan Reddick was trying to signal that Josh Allen was sacked by him, where Allen's knee was close to down. It was almost like Reddick was doing that because he wants to pad his stats as he hits free agency. When you talk about all-time terrible moves, Jets transactions, Reddick's got to be close to the top of the list. When you factor in the baggage with him, where he held out, where you factor in what they gave up for him, a 3rd-round pick, you factor in that he held out and he's giving you nothing. He's showing you nothing, and it doesn't even look like he's trying out there since he's taken the field. This guy, speaking of It's a Wonderful Life, the theme of that movie is that George Bailey, he wonders if the world would be better off if he had never been born. The Jets actually would have been better if Hassan Reddick had never taken the field. If he had just kept his held out through the whole season, the Jets would have saved cap space because they wouldn't have had to pay him a salary, and they would have kept his rights because his contract would have told him maybe they could have traded him and gotten something in return for him. This is a guy who the Jets would have been better off if this guy never played. And that's unbelievable when you're talking about an acquisition of this magnitude. Now, I know there are lots of competition for this, but this is up there with the all-time terrible Jets decisions. Just, and look, the NFL's a league and football's a game where the trenches really matter. And, in this game, the Jets got lousy play in the trenches on both sides. Now, I think the offensive line's ahead of the defensive line right now. Defensive line, you're starting from scratch. Offensive line, you've got to do better with depth. And quarterback, that's the most important position of all. And I think it's clear. If we didn't know this already, this game should have showed you it's time for a change there. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue talking about this game. In many ways, this game shows you where these two franchises are at. And in many ways, this is a microcosm of the effectiveness of the two approaches these teams have taken. We'll break that down more, continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday, breaking down just a brutal performance by the New York Jets as they were defeated yesterday by the Buffalo Bills 40-14. A game that was every bit as lopsided as the score indicates. In fact, the game may have been even more lopsided than that because the Jets got a couple garbage time touchdowns with Tyrod Taylor. It's difficult for me to not think back to the start of the season when this, and even in the offseason when the schedule came out. And it felt like this was going to be a big game. We thought the Jets were going to be a good team, or we hoped the Jets were going to be a good team. Maybe this game would decide the AFC East. Maybe it would decide a high seed in the AFC playoffs. Well, obviously it decided a high seed in the AFC playoffs because the Bills clinched the 2 seed with the win. It did not decide the AFC East. The AFC East was decided months ago. And the Bills are on their way to the playoffs. They might be the favorite to go to the Super Bowl out of the AFC. I mean, they'd be my pick out of the AFC this year. The Jets, well, they're one of the worst teams in the NFL. They're a team that still has an outside shot of picking in the top 5 in the NFL draft this spring. And it's difficult to look at these teams and not think about the approaches they've taken and the decisions they've made and the philosophies they've shown, because you have a Bills team that's, become a perennial contender for the last 5 years or so, and a Jets team that's been at the bottom of the league for the most part for the last 15 years or so. And I don't think it's an accident that the Jets are where they are and the Bills are where they are. Bills make really sound decisions. I mean, one example, we talked with Joe Marino, our friend from Locked On Bills last week, the trade of Stefon Diggs. Guy was a great player for the Bills. Guy was one of the top receivers in the league, but the Bills felt they'd be a better team without him. Sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you have to move on from a good player, and it makes your team better in the long run. Jets don't do that. The Jets would never trade a high-profile player if it made their team better. The Jets were all about collecting names the last 2 years, and Hassan Reddick's the perfect example of that. You had a guy in John Franklin Myers who was not a star. He was a meat and potatoes kind of guy. He did the dirty work. He didn't post the huge stats, but he was a perfect fit for the Jets and the defense they ran, because he gave you a third 300-pound guy on a defense where you play small and fast on your back 7. He was a guy who absorbed blocks. He's a guy who made other guys look better, but he wasn't a star. Hassan Reddick was a star who posts gaudy stats. And I know maybe this is an oversimplification, but I think there's something to this idea. And there are examples, left and right of the way the Bills have run circles around the Jets. In this game was not close. And something that kind of flew under the radar, this game was 12-0 at halftime. Jets were still kind of in the game, but it wasn't really because the Jets were good. It was because the Bills played as vanilla of a scheme on both sides of the ball in the first half as was imaginable. And the Bills made some mistakes, and Blakeman threw some penalty flags against them. The Bills kind of followed the Rams blueprint from last week, especially on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, Tony Romo in this game at CBS kept talking about how the Jets were moving the ball. The reason the Jets were moving the ball was the Bills were giving them every completion underneath they wanted. Any 5, 6, 7 yard, 8-yard completion that was the Jets could want was there for them. That's the reason the Jets were moving the ball, because the Bills pretty much just did the calculus. They said, you know what, if we don't give up a big play, we force the Jets to put together 10-play drives. And this Jets team's going to self-destruct at some point. And that's exactly what happened in the first half. Every time the Jets got into scoring range, Aaron Rodgers misses Kenny Yeboah on a play that should have been a walk-in touchdown. And then Rodgers, it seems like he's blaming Yeboah based on his reaction after the play when he throws a terrible ball. And the Jets end up turning it over on downs there. Then the next time the Jets get the ball, deflection, Rodgers gets the ball tipped, it gets picked off. Rodgers throws an interception in the second half. The Bills essentially decided, we don't need to put anything on film. They played vanilla. They played vanilla on both sides of the ball. They weren't really throwing a lot of razzle-dazzle out there. They said, we can beat these guys just straight up. We can beat them handily. We don't need to put anything on the film for our potential playoff opponents to see on us. It shows you the distance between these two teams. And another thing that I couldn't help but think about is a quarterback who won his 14th game of the season on Sunday. And that's our old friend Sam Darnold. And look, I know I always say this, quarterback wins are not a stat. They're not a personal stat. They're not an individual stat. They're a team stat. But it's difficult to look at the success Minnesota's had this season with Sam Darnold and look back on what the Jets did with Sam Darnold. And I think for the New York Jets, I think this is true of the ownership. I think it's true of a lot of people in the organization. I think it's even true in the fan base. I think there is a tendency to bemoan your bad luck, to treat this team's struggles as nothing but bad luck. But Let's think back to 2019. Let's think back to the offseason after Sam Darnold's rookie year. What did the Jets do that offseason? They retained Mike McCagnon, who was objectively at this point, indisputably, a terrible general manager. And they let him run an extremely consequential offseason where the Jets had almost the Jets were among the league leaders in cap space. That offseason, the Jets spent a record amount in free agency. And Mike McCagnon was allowed to run that offseason before they fired him. The Jets hired Adam Gase as their head coach. During that offseason, did the Jets help their young quarterback by building up a good offensive line? No. They traded for Kelechi Osemele. That was the only move they made on the offensive line. An offensive line that was terrible the year before. Did the Jets improve their skill positions a lot? Well, they got Jamison Crowder, who was a good slot receiver. And then they got Le'Veon Bell, who was a running back who hadn't played in a year. These were objectively terrible moves at the time. You can look to what I said. You can go back to those shows I did in the offseason of 2019 and hear what I had to say. These were not second guesses. These were objectively terrible and damaging decisions at the time. And these were decisions that at the time, it was clear they were going to damage Sam Darnold. And I think a lot of us, myself included, we assumed that this kid was so talented that he could overcome all of the Jets' incompetence. Well, that wasn't fair to Sam Darnold. And it wasn't realistic. You know, a quarterback that young, quarterback who was still developing, needed more support. Jets didn't give it to him. And we see this over and over. I mean, how many times have we mentioned something on the show that on this show today or in the weeks past or months past, a very shaky Jets decision, not bad luck, just something that even at the time seemed like a very shaky decision that the Jets made, which ended up hurting the franchise. And you look at Buffalo, a team that's got Super Bowl ambitions, a team that does nothing but smart moves, a team that put playmakers around their young quarterback when they drafted him, Josh Allen, a team that if you want to go back to this regime's early days, a team that the Bills made a surprise playoff run in 2017 and then kind of tore it down the year after because they realized that that team was kind of a mirage, that it did not have a firm foundation. So they tore it down. They took a step back and they ended up building a legitimate contender. This game was very much a tale of two teams. A Jets team that does everything wrong, Bills team that does a lot right. And the Jets need to start learning from their mistakes because I think the Jets view everything that happens to them as bad luck, not as the result of their own bad decisions. Well, this game showed us, the Bills have shown us, and that quarterback in Minnesota showed us that the Jets' bad decisions have consequences. And yeah, I know that I'm not saying the Jets never have bad luck. They do have their share of bad luck. But this stretch the Jets are on, this result, this game, this season, this decade and a half, it hasn't happened by accident. It's not a coincidence. This Jets team needs to get things straightened out. And we'll talk a lot about how they can try and get things straightened out in the days and weeks ahead. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday as best you can after that brutal performance. We'll be back again tomorrow to talk more Jets.